Hey, let's do a quick 10-point checklist for how to excel in Christianity, how to be the absolute best you can be. I'm really just basing this on Paul's example. He said, not that I've already obtained or I've already become perfect. That's over in Philippians 3 and verse 12. So what I see is Paul is always reaching for higher ground. His baptism, that wasn't the end. He didn't go like, well, hey, I've been converted. Why do I need to do anything else? He just kept pressing on, all the way up to the end. He was pressing on. And so you kind of wonder, well, how did he do it? And wouldn't it have been cool if he had left us a simple 10-point list, something like, say, along the lines of the Ten Commandments, just something real easy to follow. But he didn't. He left us a lot of stuff, and I think from all that stuff we can kind of make up a 10-point list, which is what we're going to do here. But he didn't leave us a literal 10-point list. But I certainly believe that if you follow the scriptures, and I'm talking about that clear, obvious statements in the scripture that we're going to look at, you're going to find out it's not that difficult to put together a little list that's going to really guide your path forward, and you will one of these days become one of those giant Christians that people look up to and go, "Wow, how did they ever get there?" And you're just going to look at them and smile and hand them a Bible and go, "Here's the path, here's the map, here's the plan. You can do it too." Now, I do want to point out one thing is I don't think simple lists are really the entire answer. I think they're helpful. I think they're a good gimmick. But when you have just a simple mentality like that, it's not foolproof. Adam and Eve had one rule. They weren't to eat of one certain tree. One simple rule, no deep theology, nothing to debate, and they blew it. Just that simple. And think of some time when you sinned and you blew it. Was it really that big of a deep, mystical thing? Like God said, don't lie, and whoops, you lied? Or is it honor your father and mother, and there you are lying to your father and mother? You get the idea. I really like a simple 10-point list. That's why I did this lesson. But I don't want you to think it's like the magic end all be all kind of thing. It certainly is not that. So, without any further introduction, let's just get right on into the 10 verses, the 10 points. Number one, make the most of your time. This is biblical. We'll give a verse for all of them. Paul wrote, therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but making the most of your time, because the days are evil. I'm going to assume, not having known Paul personally, but I'm going to assume that he made the most of his time. He looked at his time and he planned it out, and based on his schedule and the things he had going, and he had a lot of stuff going, he made the best of his time because he knew that there was nothing here on earth, no single accomplishment on earth that would ever compensate for missing God, missing his home in heaven. If he had the biggest trophy of whatever you can imagine. Make one up that just appeals to you. And all earthly people just adored and praised Paul for being the best, whatever, tent maker of all time. That wouldn't compensate. It wouldn't mean a thing once he got to heaven. Excuse me, if he were lost. Had he been lost and ended up sitting by the rich man in torment, all of those earthly accolades would have meant absolutely nothing. So I think Paul redeemed the time. He made the most of his time. Second, and this would overlap, but I think Paul had a great work ethic. In Philippians 2 and verse 12, that's where he tells us to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. I believe Paul can walk the street of gold because he had a great work ethic. He wasn't afraid to get in there and do the work that needed to be done. Remember, he said that he disciplined his own body and brought it into subjection. Remember also, he said that he took every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Now, that verse is over in 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 5. The one about disciplining his body is in 1 Corinthians 9 and 27. So you have a man there who had a great, awesome work ethic and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, doing the spiritual work he needed to do. And I want to make a clear distinction here, not just the work that needed to be done outside around him, but the work that needed to be done inside of himself. And I think that's where most people mess up. They're so busy looking outside, they never look inside. Number three, diligent effort. God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Hebrews 11 and verse 6. And so we have Paul, who is also very diligent and persistent. He's near the end of his life in our opening verse there in Philippians 3:12. And he says, I press on. He knew that the alluring distractions of the world were not going to get him closer to God. He wanted to draw nearer to God, as James 4:8 would talk about, or he was pressing forward to be holy as God is holy, like Peter would write about in 1 Peter 1, verse 15 and 16. And so it took that diligent, consistent, that really focused effort to stay on target even after he had accomplished so much. And if he stumbled, and we don't have that kind of detail about his life, but let's assume he did. I don't think anybody bats 1,000. He understood what Proverbs 24 and 16 talked about, that a righteous man, he may fall 7 times, but he gets back up too. And that's the difference. That's the diligent effort. You don't just throw in the towel because you messed it up some. Number 4, I would give you body language. And I would go back to our 1 Corinthians 9:27 where he said he disciplined his body. But before that, he said that he didn't beat the air. He ran with control. He ran with a goal in mind. So he wasn't just trying to pretend to be Christian. He wasn't what I would call a Sunday only Christian. He knew that he had to be all in it. And if his heart was all in it, then his body language would be all in it too. It would be flowing out of his body. It wouldn't be something he imposed on his body, but it would just naturally be there. And you would see it in his eyes, and you would see that spark and that interest and that excitement. You would hear it in the tone of his voice. And you know exactly what I'm talking about. You can walk up to a group of folks, and if they're talking about a really good ball game, you hear it in their voice, you see it in their eyes, you almost feel the energy in the air. And then you bring up a Bible verse or a Bible subject, and you see the energy just drop down to about zero. Paul's energy wouldn't drop down to about zero. Paul would have been one of those people, had you been talking about the ball game, he would have been at zero. And you brought up the Bible idea, subject, and spirituality, then you would have seen his energy, his body language come up and get excited. So that brings us to number 5, which is just flat out energy. Paul said, I press on toward the goal for the call of the upward gospel, for the upward call of God in Christ Jesus, Philippians 3:4. He was successful because he had that energy to press forward. He understood it was a straight and narrow way. He knew it was going to be hard. Paul wasn't a modern millennial, sissy, crybaby, weak, scared to get his hands dirty and extend any effort kind of person. He wasn't one of these little crybabies that wanted to sit around and hold a remote control all day or swipe on a screen. He wasn't afraid to get in the arena, get out there, mix it up, and get his nose bloody and take a few punches. He had that kind of energy. That's actually passion, is what that energy is. He wanted to be in the game. He was like, let me in, coach. He wasn't sitting in the bleachers. He wanted to fight a good fight. And that brings us to number 6, which is just an awesome attitude. Paul's example in Philippians 3:8 is he said, I count all things lost. Everything was, there's nothing on earth worth hanging on to. When it's all over, said and done, and you get that eternal perspective, there's just nothing that you can accomplish that ends at the grave that you would sit there in eternal run and go, yeah, but at least I had $1 billion, or at least I had a Rolls Royce, or at least I had a 3-story mansion. None of that. You don't look back at any of that and think, yeah, but it was worth it. I don't mind being in hell. The rich man, he wasn't happy. Uh, Best we can tell, he had it all in his day, and it didn't compensate for having missed it. So it's that great attitude of, my trophy is on the other side of the tombstone, not over here. And let's go to then number 7, and that is just learn to be coachable. James said, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. We got to be coachable. God is coaching us through life. He knew what he was doing when he put all this together. Incidentally, that's James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4. And Paul was coachable. That would be number 7 on the list I'm putting together for him. He knew that you had to do some training, and sometimes it hurt. Sometimes you got the end of training and you were worn out and you were exhausted. You needed a good night's sleep. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And so he looked at those various trials and he knew that as he went through them, he'd be a better, stronger, more capable, more powerful opponent against Satan. That takes us back to attitude, doesn't it? So let's go on to number 8. And that is number 8 on our 10-point checklist would be doing extra. Christ said it this way: if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. And whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. I don't think you'll ever describe Paul as a person who just did enough to hopefully squeak by and barely get into heaven by the skin of his teeth. Paul was one who he gave it his all. He poured his heart into it. There was no just squeaking in to heaven for Paul. Now, incidentally, I think if you're just trying to squeak in, you're not going in anyway. That's going to get you into the condemnation of Revelation chapter 3, verse 15 and 16, where Christ is the lukewarm, he will spew out. Paul was doing extra because he understood that he was investing treasures in heaven. He was laying up treasures in heaven, as Christ would say it. And when you have that understanding, then doing extra is not doing extra, not in a negative way, but in a very positive, self-benefiting way. Number 9, you're going to be prepared. And you got to be prepared. Christ said in Matthew 24, and I'm going to use verse 42 beginning, he says, be on the alert. You don't know what day the Lord's coming. And you don't, do you? You don't know what day the Lord's coming, and you don't know what day you may be going. But we know this for sure, that we're all going because it's appointed unto man once to die. And we know that someday the Lord's coming back. One of these days, one of those 2 events is going to happen to you. And those people who procrastinate, thinking, well, later on I'll get it, later on I'll get it, are just playing a fool's game. And they're going to end up in eternal ruin because they never were truly prepared to meet their Maker. And then number 10, which I think is the most important, and that's just simply passion. You have got to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. That is the greatest thing that I would put on the list. And I would have put that number 1 on the list, but I really wanted it down here at the end where it would linger with you as this podcast comes to an end. Passion isn't just something you talk about, it's something you feel. It gets you up in the morning, it carries you through the hard times, and empowers you. It underlies and weaves through all the previous 9 things that we mentioned. It is that burning love, that zeal, that obsession with God. And that becomes an inner power that wells up on the inside. You know, Christ said to the woman at the well, the water I give will become a well of water in that person. And that's what passion does. It becomes that well of energy, power streaming in us that carries us forward day by day. So I get Paul didn't leave a literal 10-point list. Been kind of neat if he had. That's the 10-point list I'd put together as I think about Paul and his example and what we can read about him. And of course, you can expand on that and add other things to that list as you want. The important thing is that we follow his example as he followed the footsteps of Jesus. Or as he said in 1 Corinthians 11:1, imitate me as I also imitate Christ. So there's your podcast. There's your 10-point list. I hope it adds some benefit to your life. And as always, I hope you have a great day.